The moment everyone laughed at Samantha Markle was the exact moment they stopped paying attention to the one person who might have been telling the truth the entire time. She wasn't dramatic in the way people expected. She didn't arrive with screaming headlines or explosive evidence dropped overnight. No, what she did was quieter, more dangerous. She pointed, calmly, repeatedly, at gaps no one wanted to look at. And those gaps didn't disappear. They widened, they multiplied, they started connecting.
For Meghan Markle, because her sister Samantha ain't going anywhere.
I don't believe, and he doesn't believe, that there are kids, because you don't yank around and use a leg.
Meghan was having another baby at the same time that the rest of us did.
Yeah.
They called her bitter. They called her irrelevant. They built a narrative around her before she even had a chance to speak, turning her into background noise before the audience could decide for themselves. And that framing, that was the first move. Because once someone is labeled untrustworthy, you don't have to disprove what they say. You just have to make sure no one listens long enough to question it. But here's where it gets uncomfortable. Years later, voices that once ignored her started shifting, quietly, carefully, and then suddenly, not so quietly anymore. Because when a respected investigator like Tom Bauer looks back and says, "We all laughed and she was right," that's not gossip anymore. That's a crack in the foundation, and cracks spread. But let's go back, because this didn't start with documents or sealed records. It started with perception. When Meghan Markle entered the royal orbit, her story was already polished, curated, refined into something almost too clean. A narrative of independence, struggle, reinvention. It worked. It was compelling. It was believable. But only if you didn't look too closely at the parts that were missing.
They'll leak their conversations to the media.
But Meghan's sister, Samantha Markle, says that is causing her father...
Because every time Samantha spoke, the focus shifted, not to what she was saying, but to how she was saying it. Too loud, too frequent, too messy. And while everyone rolled their eyes at the delivery, nobody stopped to examine the content, the patterns, the inconsistencies, the timeline that didn't quite sit right. That's how something real hides in plain sight. Not by disappearing, but by being surrounded with enough noise that nobody wants to sort through it. And then something shifted, slowly at first. Documents that should have been simple weren't. Timelines that should have been clear weren't. People who had nothing to gain started describing a version of Meghan that didn't fully match the public one. Not cruel, not unlikable, something else. Calculated, that word kept surfacing. Not ambition. Calculation, and those two are not the same.
About Meghan, so some would then suggest that the book is biased.
Well, it's not biased in the sense that I do my very best.
Because ambition reacts. Calculation plans. It maps outcomes before they happen. And suddenly, details that once sounded strange started fitting into a pattern that was harder to dismiss. The vision board story. The idea that Prince Harry wasn't just someone she met, but someone she anticipated, positioned for, moved toward. On its own, it sounds absurd, but patterns don't rely on one detail. They rely on repetition.
She wants it to be all about her, and I could see exactly the reason why she wasn't invited. To really break it down, it's been a disservice.
And repetition is exactly what keeps showing up. Relationships aligning with opportunity, narratives aligning with timing, gaps aligning with moments where clarity should exist. And then the first real fracture, not gossip, not speculation, documentation, a formal request, no drama, no agenda, just a name, Rachel Meghan Markle. And what came back wasn't nothing. It was confirmation. A child, born in 1997. And then silence. Because the record's sealed, now here's where the story stops being comfortable. Sealed records aren't illegal. They're not even unusual. But timing matters. Context matters. And when something is sealed right as a public identity is forming, right as a narrative is being constructed, it stops feeling like coincidence and starts feeling like control. And then the pattern repeats. A marriage that happens quietly. Witnesses who barely know the couple. Family members unaware. Documents thinner than they should be. A life event that should leave a clear trail, leaving almost nothing behind.
Appropriate, very warm, and the public knew nothing about that. It was like, there were so many different stories.
And suddenly, it's not one gap anymore. It's a system of gaps, each one explainable on its own. But together, they form something harder to ignore. Because absence, real absence, isn't something you can fake. You can forge documents, you can spin narratives, but you can't easily explain why something that should exist doesn't. And that's where the story turns darker. Because now we're not just talking about missing pieces, we're talking about people, real people, like Joe Giuliani, Giuliano, a relationship that existed, a timeline that overlaps, and then claims that don't quite align with the record but don't disappear either.
On Lilibet's birth certificate, which was obtained by Access Hollywood, only one of Lily's parents was referenced.
Because here's the unsettling part. The claims don't need to be fully proven to matter. The behavior around them is enough. Allegations of silence, of warnings, of connections being erased, photos disappearing, history spinning out. And even if every claim about a child turns out to be wrong, the question remains. Why the cleanup? Because people with nothing to hide don't erase. They don't preemptively control narratives from decades ago. They don't leave behind this level of strategic emptiness. And then comes the internet. Loud, chaotic, unfiltered, taking fragments of truth and layering them with exaggeration until the original question becomes buried under its own noise. The ghost groom theory explodes. Secret marriages, hidden ceremonies, none of it holds. It collapses. And when it does, everything collapses with it, including the parts that were never disproven in the first place. That's the trick. Let the noise get so loud that when it fails, nobody goes back to separate what was real from what wasn't. And just like that, a confirmed sealed record becomes just another conspiracy. But it never actually went away, because the real question was never about secret weddings or viral theories. It was always simpler, more precise. Why does a sealed birth record exist under her legal name? Who was connected to it? And why has that question never been directly answered? And just when the noise fades, the focus shifts again. Closer, more personal. Because now it's not distant figures or forgotten relationships. Now it's family. Someone who should know. Someone who can't claim distance. Someone who was there. The silence didn't break. It shifted. It moved from distant names and blurred timelines into something far more dangerous: proximity. Because when a story refuses to resolve through documents, it starts looking for answers in people. And that's exactly where it went next. Straight into the inner circle. Straight into family. Straight into someone who couldn't claim distance or confusion. Someone who had been there. And what came back wasn't denial. It wasn't outrage. It wasn't even dismissal. It was something far more unsettling. A response that described but didn't clarify. A sentence that acknowledged but didn't resolve. She looked pregnant and I was there. That's not an answer. That's a doorway. And once it opens, it doesn't close. Because in stories like this, what people don't say matters more than what they do. Silence becomes a language. And when multiple people connected to the same narrative all choose the same kind of silence, it stops being coincidence. It starts looking like alignment. Joe Giuliano doesn't speak. Trevor Engelson doesn't explain. Thomas Markle speaks, but by the time he does, his credibility has already been dismantled piece by piece, pre-labeled, pre-dismissed. And the pattern across all of them feels engineered, not chaotic, not emotional, controlled, because real family conflicts are messy. They spill, they contradict, they expose. This one doesn't. This one tightens, it compresses, it filters what gets through and what doesn't. And when that happens, you're not watching a family fall apart. You're watching something being managed. And management requires structure. It requires timing. It requires knowing which voices to amplify and which ones to neutralize before they become a problem. That's not speculation. That's how high-level public narratives survive under pressure. And when even experienced investigators like Andrew Morton and Tom Bauer describe hitting walls, repeated walls, it stops sounding accidental, because walls don't build themselves. And then the question emerges, quietly, reluctantly, and once it's asked, it doesn't disappear. It multiplies. If the official version doesn't align completely, what actually happened? And that's when the narrative crosses a line, because now it's not about perception, it's about possibility, about whether something fundamental was presented one way and lived another. And the implications of that, they don't stay personal. They extend outward, into systems, into structures that rely entirely on public trust. Because if multiple parties knew one version and presented another, that's not miscommunication. That's coordination. And still, no response, no direct statement, no attempt to shut it down completely. Just the same controlled silence that has followed every stage of this story. And that silence doesn't feel defensive, it feels calculated, because acknowledging the question would give it weight, but ignoring it, that keeps it suspended. Unresolved, unfinished, and unfinished stories are the most dangerous kind, because they don't end, they evolve. The calls for clarity don't come from one place. They don't come from one voice. They appear across different spaces, different people, different perspectives that don't seem connected. And that independence, that lack of coordination, makes it harder to dismiss entirely. Because when the same question emerges from different directions, it stops looking like a rumor and starts looking like pressure. And pressure builds. Because here's what this this all comes down to. Not one claim, not one theory, a pattern. A consistent, repeating structure where documentation narrows, where voices fall silent, where narratives align too perfectly, and where every unresolved question leads to another one just beneath it. A sealed record that still exists. A timeline that still doesn't fully connect. People who still choose not to speak clearly when given the chance. And an institution that remains untouched, at least on the surface. But surface stability doesn't mean absence of cracks. It just means they haven't split open yet. And that's the part no one can predict. Because silence only holds for as long as it's useful, for as long as everyone involved benefits from maintaining it. The moment that balance shifts, the moment one person decides the cost of staying quiet is higher than the cost of speaking, everything changes. And when it does, it won't arrive as a rumor. It won't arrive quietly. It will arrive with something that cannot be ignored, cannot be reframed, cannot be buried under noise. Until then, the questions remain exactly where Samantha Markle left them. Not answered, not disproven, just waiting.